Today's episode, we're going to talk a little bit about waves. And in this particular case, the waves of immigration and emigration that entered and left Wales and what was causing it, what was driving it, what's the pull and push of everything that was being made decision wise, and why this transition was so important to Wales in general. And we're going to go into this in more detail in just one moment. In the closing decades of the 19th century, Wales was a nation on the move. Between 1880 and 1900, hundreds of thousands of people either left Welsh shores for opportunities abroad or arrived to seek work in the booming industrial valleys. This movement of people, both outward and inward, would reshape the population, language, and social character of Wales in a profound way. So, what do we mean by emigration? By the 1880s, emigration from Wales had become a well-established pattern. Although earlier decades had seen great migrations to Patagonia and the United States and parts of Canada, from the period of 1880 to 1900, that 20-year period before the start of the 20th century, that continuing trend hit a steady, if smaller, wave of departures to those areas. Census evidence and emigration records show that much like much of Britain, Wales experienced a significant outflow of people in the 1880s. Many of those leaving were not from rural farmsteads, but from industrial urban backgrounds. The industrial economy was volatile. Booms and slumps in coal, iron, and slate had pushed workers to look overseas for stability and higher wages. Something that's a draw quite frequently is economics, and it will continue to be a draw for people both in and out of the next century and a bit. One of the best documented examples comes from the letters held by the National Library of Wales in Raising the Wind, Letters of Welsh Immigrants from 1850 to 1910. Historian Brindley Thomas collected correspondence that shows how ordinary families describe their motives and experiences. A letter written from Scranton, Pennsylvania, as an example, in 1880s by a miner named David Davies of Aberdare, he tells his family, quote, "I am earning a steady living here and send what I can home. Yet there is not a day that I do not think of Cumranda and the singing on Sundays." End quote. The letter survives in the National Library collection. It captures both the economic realism and the emotion of Hairath, the longing for Wales that becomes a hallmark of immigration life. I will say that is something I have felt before. After living in Wales for 4 years, when I got back to Canada, the desire to move back to Wales was super strong. So I can kind of see why people felt like that when you come, and I can see why people would come from their home and feel similarly. It's one of those things which pulls at you in ways that you're not expecting. My own personal experience, really briefly, I noticed it in small things when you're living in other countries. There's little things that can suddenly become important, suddenly catch your attention. The way certain things are offered is so different. It throws you off in a way that you're not expecting. And it's not the big things, it's the little things that actually cause you to get homesick, I think. Because I feel like, the different money or the different, you know, cultural experience from one country to another is one thing. But when you have little things that pull at you fairly regularly because they're kind of your usual everyday when you're at home and you go abroad and all of a sudden that's not there, it then pulls at you a different way. And conversely, I found that going back when I went back to Canada, things that I got very used to in Britain, being able to do certain things or the way people spoke or the friendliness and openness changing in such a way that you're not used to after you spend so much time somewhere. That also kind of pulls at you in a different way and it creates a level of homesickness that maybe you weren't expecting. One in which your homesickness is for the previous country that you've just left. And I think that's something that it's hard to explain. And I think that's something to keep in mind with all of this. We're not just talking about people who are moving and they're never going back or they're washing their hands at the place. Quite frequently, they have points where they wish they could move back. They have times where they wish they could go home and see their loved ones and spend time with them, because there's that feeling of loneliness that you have when you live in a different country and you don't have the same contacts or ability to talk to the same people that you're used to. And all of those things can pull at you. And especially in this time period when the only way you can really talk to someone is via a letter, that makes it much more difficult. Phones aren't a normal thing yet. There isn't a cross Atlantic, cable of phone wire that's going to suddenly make it easier to contact people. All of that kind of stuff takes away the day to day, and all of a sudden you're dealing with something much more frequently that you weren't expecting, which is a sense of separation. And again, that's something everybody's probably experienced in those situations. But at the same time, everybody has to deal with it. Everybody finds their own way around it. But anyway, let's go back to the point of this. Most immigrants headed to the industrial United States, into Pennsylvania, Ohio, and New York in particular, where Welsh mining and ironwork skills were in high demand. Smaller numbers went to Canada and Australia. Others joined established Welsh settlements in Patagonia, Argentina. Founded in the 1860s, we've talked about this, so I'm not going to go through it again, but that was a draw for some people. Economic conditions were, of course, the main driver, but also agricultural depression, reduced opportunities in rural Wales, while downturns in the economies in the urban areas continued to cause unemployment, and all of those would be reasons for people to leave. Combined with that, steamship fares had become cheaper because they're happening more frequently. Steamships are becoming more reliable. All of these things are helping. Doesn't mean it's 100% working well. There are still sinkings, as we'll talk about probably at some point, but there is a lot more frequent travel, and it is generally safer than it's ever been. Along with that, there are improved postal links, which means news and money could flow easily between Wales and places like the United States, Canada, and instead of it taking months to get somewhere, it could take weeks, which is much quicker. And of course, chain migration then followed. Once a few families from Merthyr or Llanelli or Bangor had settled abroad, friends and relatives, of course, would soon follow. Emigration had several effects on Wales. It drained some of the rural counties, particularly Cardiganshire and Montgomeryshire, parts of North Wales, of young adults, reducing the rural population density in the process. But it also created a new global Welsh network. Chapels, cultural events, and Welsh language newspapers abroad kept cultural ties alive. We still see that today. There are still people who live in the New World and other places that speak Welsh, that try and talk and have Welsh culture there. Is it advanced to say Scotland's version of that or the Irish version of that? No, but it does exist. Many immigrants sent home money and supplemented family incomes during the times of these depressed rural parishes. Wales was not losing people into the void. It was exporting labor and faith and language that would echo back in letters, remittance, and occasionally return migration. Now, while thousands left, Wales absorbed a much larger number of newcomers, especially in the coal valleys of the south. This was one of the most dramatic population surges in Europe at the time. South Wales coalfields was expanding at a furious pace between 1881 and 1901. Glamorgan's population had more than doubled, and the parish of Ystrad in Rhondda leapt from 55,000 people to over 113,000 people. The demands for coal to fuel ships, railways, and factories meant that Welsh pits needed vast numbers of workers. Early in the century, much of the labor had come from within Wales. Men from Carmarthenshire, Cardiganshire, and North Wales moved south to work, but by the 1890s, the local sources could no longer supply enough miners, and increasingly migrants were coming from England, particularly from the West Country, Somerset, and Gloucestershire, and there was also Irish workers in Cardiff, Swansea, and the valleys, some of whose families had settled since the famine years. In Cardiff, Irish-born residents still made up a notable share of the city's dockland population, and from 1881 and 1891, these were showing up in our censuses. One particularly large community of course, were the Irish. Cardiff's Irish population is the best documented, and from that 10-year period that we mentioned, Irish-born residents spread across the industrial areas of Glamorgan and Monmouthshire. In Merthyr Tydfil, Irish labourers continued to work in construction, railways, and ironworks. The Tredegar riots of 1882, though primarily about wages, also saw tensions between local and Irish workers, evidence of both integration and occasional friction that accompanied migration. By 1901, second-generation Irish were often not recorded as Irish-born, yet they remained prominent in the dockside parishes, particularly in Bute Town, in brackets Tiger Bay as it was then known, in Cardiff. Another smaller number of immigrant groups also began to appear in the late Victorian Wales. A handful of Italians and Jewish families established businesses in Cardiff and Swansea, running cafes, tailoring shops, and small factories. The movement of these communities into Wales showed that the country's economic engine was drawing interest from places other than England and rural Wales. Jewish migration into Wales picked up in 1881 due to the pogroms and hardships in Eastern Europe. This was a time of great persecution of Jews and blaming of Jews for financial and other struggles, something that would continue obviously until the 1940s. And it was something that drove a lot of migration out of Eastern Europe for a lot of people, and not just Jewish people. There was loads of Ukrainians and others that moved away from what was then the Russian Empire to try and escape some of the persecution and problems. Same thing in Poland, which of course was also in the Russian Empire at this point, and a number of other places. There was just a sense of wanting to get away. And one thing that a lot of these countries would do, i.e., I can use the example of Canada, they actually tried to entice these workers to come by giving them enticements of land and all sorts of different things to try and convince them to move there. In part because they're trying to fill up what amounts to, I don't want to describe it this way because obviously it's not quite the same, but they're trying to fill up the empty space between Vancouver and Toronto if we're talking Canada. And so one way to do it is bring in massive populations from outside of the country to fill, in quotes, the middle bit. Now, the earliest Jewish congregations had existed since the mid-19th century in places like Swansea and Cardiff and Merthyr, but they expanded markedly in this 10-year period between the 1880s and 1890s. The Cardiff Hebrew congregation minutes note that by 1896 they had nearly 400 members, many from Lithuania and Poland. Swansea's Jewish population rose to about 150 by 1891, while Tredegar and Bryn Mawr saw small clusters of traders and pawnbrokers, occupations very common amongst Jewish immigrants across Britain. One vivid account appears in the memoirs From the Baltic to Bute Street by Reuben Davis, written in Cardiff in the early 1900s, describing how his parents came from Kovno in the Russian Empire in 1888, setting up a drapery on Bute Street with other families from the same town. His recollections mirror broader Jewish patterns of settlement, small-scale business and community networks centered on synagogues and benevolence societies. Jewish immigrants added to the diversity of the docks and the industry by establishing Hebrew schools and charity groups that served both religious and social needs. By 1900, Cardiff had 2 synagogues and an active, and I apologize if I say this wrong, I cannot remember how it's properly pronounced, so I'm going to do my best, is Shevra Kadisha, or burial society, indicating a settling and growing community. The Italian presence in Wales also grew during this period, often beginning with seafaring or catering families from the Bardi or Lucia in northern Italy. In 1891, census lists grew to about 150 Italian-born residents in Cardiff, Swansea, and Newport. Many worked as ice cream sellers, confectioners, or cafe owners, occupying a position that would later become emblematic of Italian-Welsh identity in the early 20th century. Early arrivals such as Luigi and Maria Risi of Swansea appear in trade directories of 1895 And the Valentines of Cardiff opened one of the first Italian cafes on Bute Street in 1898. Smaller groups of Greek, Maltese, and Arab seafarers also lived in the port districts like Bute Town. Recorded in ship manifests and parish lists, Bute Town by 1900 was a miniature world port, home to Somali, Yemeni, Maltese, and Caribbean sailors who often married local women and took up residence in Tiger Bay in Cardiff. These movements changed the texture of Welsh life. Industrial villages that had been small farming communities in the 1850s became large, multi-ethnic, English-speaking towns by 1900. Census data shows that in parts of Fronda, over 60% of the residents had been born outside of the county, and nearly a third were born outside of Wales altogether. The newcomers and native Welsh did not always live separate lives. Coal mining communities forged strong occupational identities that sometimes overrode regional origins. Yet differences could still be felt in accents, religious habits, and language. Welsh-speaking chapel life remained powerful, but English increasingly had become the language of work, trade, and schooling in the industrial districts. Accounts from the period, such as those of the South Wales Daily News, or in the writings of social observers like G.R. Sims, describe overcrowded terraces, inadequate sanitation, and a sense of ceaseless energy. Housing, schools, and chapels multiplied to accommodate the influx. Local authorities struggled to keep up. Yet, the same growth generated a sense of civic pride. Cardiff, Swansea, and Newport expanded their docks, railways, and cultural institutions, projecting a new urban identity for Wales. As you can imagine, a lot of that would have a great deal of impact on Wales as a whole, becoming more English, becoming more culturally driven by the English language, certainly would make changes to the population, and it's going to be something that will continue for the, decades to come, let's be honest. Migration, both the emigration and immigration, had altered Wales in measurable ways. Economically, the influx of labor made Wales one of the industrial powerhouses of the British Empire. Coal exports from Cardiff, Barry, and Newport dominated world trade by the 1890s. Without the migrants who poured into the valleys, that boom would not have been possible. Culturally and linguistically, migration brought mixed results. The industrial South became less Welsh-speaking, as I mentioned, while the rural North and West preserved the language more strongly. By 1901, the census record showed that in Glamorgan, only 25% of the people could even speak Welsh, compared to over 70% in places like Merioneth and Carnarvonshire. The shift was not merely numerical. It also marked the beginning of the cultural divide between the industrial and rural parts of Wales. For those who left, the effects were emotional as well as economic. Emigrant letters were filled with longing for home, or hiraeth, but also a pride in their Welsh identity abroad. Welsh chapels in Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Patagonia kept the language alive long after it had faded from parts of the valleys. The emigrants kept and helped internationalize Welsh culture even as they reduced its footprint at home. For those who arrived, Wales offered work and community, and if not always comfort. Immigrants and internal migrants filled the new towns and shared in their hardships and helped to build societies that would become what we know of the 20th century in Wales. Their descendants would be as Welsh as those whose ancestors had lived there for centuries. Finally, between the 1880s and 1900, Wales had simultaneously become a land of departure and arrival, exporting its people to the wider world while drawing thousands in. These opposing currents reshaped its demography, its language, and economy, as you can imagine. Emigration gave Wales a far-flung diaspora and a sense of international connection. Immigration fueled its rise as an industrial nation. Together, they made late Victorian Wales more deeply local and unmistakably global. The country that entered the 20th century had no longer the same small rural land of chapels and farms. It had become a modern industrial society shaped by movement, opportunity, and human resilience. And with all of that, I'd like to thank you all for listening. I hope this has been an educational episode. We've tried to address some of the issues. Obviously, We're going to talk a lot about immigration and emigration. It affects so many people in so many different ways. Let me be clear in saying we're going to continue to look at this from an academic point of view. We're not going to prejudge what group did what and who did this and who did that and what to evaluate a person on. We will simply give you the information and let you make your own choices and decisions on how you want to interpret it. But for me, as someone who was a migrant, I have a special place with it. I mean, my family is an immigrant family. We both on my mother's side in a far distant few years, and then in my dad's side from a fairly immediate few years for me personally. They moved from Britain to Canada, and in doing so, they changed how my life worked out. Conversely, my moving to Britain affected me. Living in Wales for 4 years definitely affected me. My desire to move back in the next few months is definitely driven in part because of that. As we go on, we're going to talk a lot about immigration and migration. It's just an issue that will continually pop up because there's so much that changes a country in these points. Like, we're going to have a lot more people moving to Wales. I think it is, from a historical standpoint, important for us to cover. And we will continue to do so, just as we do with women's rights, just as we do with the rights of racial minorities. And we talk a little bit about it. We haven't done loads on it yet, but that's coming because the 20th century is going to change the demographics of Wales quite graphically. And we're going to get into a lot more of some of that. But we're closing in on the end of the Victorian period. We're closing in on the end of the 1800s for the first time in a while. And I expect that by the time we get to 2026, we'll be starting in on the 20th century and the major change that's coming for everybody in that point with the advent of what becomes World War I and how that changes the entire balance of the world. And anyway, with all of that said and done, I'd like to thank you all for listening or watching or whatever today. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, you can always reach me at welshhistorypodcast@gmail.com. You can reach out to me at usually any other social media at Welsh History Pod, the exception being Facebook, where it's facebook.com/Welsh History Podcast. If you want to check out our stuff on YouTube, it's at Welsh History Podcast. And if you'd like to help the podcast in some financial way, you can contribute at patreon.com/Welsh History. Thank you guys so much. We'll talk to you next time. Take care. Bye-bye. Welsh History Podcasts is a member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. To find more information on them, you can do so at evergreenpodcasts.com. Thanks for listening.